It is the new front line in America's multi-layered defense network. A top general reveals a future battlefield is already taking form in space.
For better or worse, space has become a warfighting domain.
Chaos 3-1, single group, bullseye 280, 39, 20,000 hostile maneuver.
Following good hits, dead man.
Is conflict in space inevitable?
We don't want there to be a war in space. We want all of humanity to continue to use all the benefits of space for all of our good. But if others choose to start a war there, we'll be ready.
Preparing for a conflict no one wants. While the U.S. has been rushing military supplies to support Ukrainian forces battling the Russian military, another potential battlefield may be taking shape in space. And no, we're not talking about futuristic sci-fi movies. While the very idea of militarizing space is very disturbing to anyone who is intrigued with exploring what lies beyond Earth, Space Force was created because military commanders say America's adversaries are already demonstrating hostile intent in orbit. And in today's digital world connected by satellites, the entire global economy and the U.S. military are very dependent on instant satellite connectivity, something we're seeing firsthand on the battlefield in Ukraine. After decades of Cold War proxy battles between the U.S. and Russia, the battlefield in Ukraine quickly turned into a proving ground for the latest military hardware. From high-flying drones that shadow and target Russian tanks, to shoulder-fired weapons and advanced missile launchers, many guided by the constellation of 30 U.S. Space Force-operated orbiting GPS satellites. But at the Pentagon, four-star Space Force General David Thompson says Russia has been jamming the GPS signal on the ground in Ukraine, the same signal that the U.S. provides to the world for free.
It's that localized ability to jam the signal so that local receivers can't receive the information.
Ukrainians unable to access GPS because it's being jammed locally on the ground.
That's right. Ukrainians may not be able to use GPS because there are jammers around that prevent them from receiving and using the signal effectively.
U.S. military sources also claim Russia has launched cyber attacks against the SpaceX Starlink satellites over Ukraine that provide the country with internet access. Though SpaceX engineers were able to defend against the attack by rewriting several lines of computer code. And European airlines, first reported by Finnair, accuse Russia of jamming the GPS signals along its borders with Finland that civilian airlines rely on. Russia, China, and Europe all have their own GPS satellite networks, but most of the world, including Ukraine and the global economy, depend on the U.S. GPS network, accurate to within a foot and a half. From suburban drivers to international shipping, to farming, to banking, to disaster response, to those Ukrainian military units, the U.S. Space Force is charged with protecting America's GPS network. We were given rare access to this secure command center where they monitor all U.S. GPS satellites for any signs of failure or foreign interference.
We're providing position navigation.
Major Lauren Taylor directs the operations here.
Each satellite actually broadcasts multiple signals, so the civilians get their signal, the military gets their signal.
Interestingly, the Russians and the Chinese can use our GPS satellites as well.
I bet you they do.
You taking that A5 over there?
Under U.S. law, the GPS system cannot be turned off to anyone. But military commanders say what's happening in orbit now is even more concerning, accusing both Russia and China of putting weapons in space.
It is truly a warfighting domain. Our adversaries are fielding specific weapon systems in the domain, so we need to view it as such.
And in a dramatic anti-satellite test in November 2021, Russia targeted and blew up one of its own satellites using a ground-based missile, creating a massive orbiting debris field with more than 1,600 pieces. The space station forced to adjust its position to avoid getting hit.
Indeed, the space station was threatened, which, by the way, not only have astronauts, it has cosmonauts on it.
China conducted a similar test in 2007, creating 3,000 pieces of orbiting debris.
I think they're trying to send a message that they could target somebody else as well. And now we have to deal with the aftermath of those tests.
The Pentagon says Russia has also deployed a nesting satellite that carries an offensive weapon, which it has already used to test fire a missile or bullet, very close to a top-secret American spy satellite.
They launched a satellite. They launched it into an orbit very close to one of our sensitive national security satellites. They maneuvered around that satellite in what we would call a hazardous and an unsafe and unprofessional manner. Then they backed that satellite off. What they did is that they then released a target. So the satellite had a target. They released that target. I would just call it a bullet, basically. It was a projectile. They just fired, I'll call it a bullet, from one satellite to the other. And the Russians knew very well that we could observe this. They were also making a very clear statement to us about their intention to threaten our capabilities.
And China has deployed a satellite with a robotic arm and claw that can reach out and grab or damage another satellite. Vice President Kamala Harris at Vandenberg Space Force Base in April.
These weapons are intended to deny the United States our ability to use our space capabilities by destroying our satellites.
Line down.
Keeping watch over America's military and spy satellites is the top priority at this classified Space Force Ops Center in Colorado. More than 70% of military satellite communications come through here. Everything from nuclear command and control orders to presidential communications, down to a Coast Guard cutter, a submarine, even tactical units on the ground. Lieutenant Christine Kovac's job is to keep an eagle eye on those satellites.
If they don't have the communications when they need it, things can go seriously wrong. So we're here providing that perfect, reliable communication.
How vulnerable are American satellites? The Pentagon says China's space program is now outpacing the U.S. with more than 60 launches in 2022, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon invisible to U.S. satellites. And U.S. generals worry Beijing could soon deploy satellites and offensive weapons in the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar, invisible to U.S. satellites.
We need to understand both in the lunar space and the space between the Earth and the moon. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Does it pose a potential threat to our interests?
A military spacecraft in a very well designed trajectory can enable space situational awareness.
Physicist Camille Lance says a spacecraft in cislunar space could have strategic superiority.
Can enable a person or entity to be in a location which you have an advantage.
It's a big reason why Space Force has bipartisan support in Congress and a growing budget.
We have to remember, we are not weaponizing space. Space has already been weaponized by China and Russia. We have to be able to defend our assets, and we've got to be more aggressive in doing so.
In the coming years, the U.S. is preparing to launch a satellite to cislunar to monitor Chinese activity. And commercial satellite operators are expected to add their satellite eyes to the cislunar space domain, hoping to gain the high ground or first mover advantage.
All of the activity that's happening on the moon has to go through cislunar space. So the ability to have a spacecraft in the cislunar domain enables the U.S. the first mover advantage for owning the cislunar environment.
On Earth, there are clear rules of the sea laid out over centuries, like this incident in 2020 when a Russian warship threatened to ram a U.S. destroyer in a rare naval standoff in the Sea of Japan. Russia claiming the U.S. was operating illegally in its territorial waters. The U.S. Navy saying the destroyer was operating in international waters. But there are very few rules in space. How do you determine what is a hostile act in space?
We're working through that now. We don't have that history like we do in the other domains to build upon. And so as we're encountering these threatening activities for the first time, it's forcing us to really define these terms.
When we come back, the Biden administration says the U.S. will not play by the same rules in space that Russia and China are playing by.
Simply put, these tests are dangerous, and we will not conduct them.
And liftoff. For decades, the U.S. Air Force and its Space Command have been responsible for launching America's spy and military satellites.
ASAT launch from Grid Whiskey Charlie 6. How copy? Copy. ASAT launch. Initiating threat reaction.
But in 2019, with more countries competing in low Earth orbit, the White House and Congress consolidated those responsibilities under a brand new Space Force.
American leadership in space is more important than it ever has been.
Signed into law by President Trump with a Delta symbol borrowed from the earliest days of the Air Force.
Scotty, stop all engines.
And perhaps a little Star Trek, too.
Holes have gone crazy.
Space Force was quickly lampooned by a Steve Carell comedy on Netflix.
The president is creating a new branch, Space Force, which Mark will run.
What? But within the military, it's a response to a very real threat. Space Force is the newest branch of the military underneath the Department of the Air Force. This is the Space Force corridor at the Pentagon, where the focus 24/7 is in protecting U.S. assets and interests beyond the Earth, from low Earth orbit to the moon and beyond. As the Navy has sailors and the Army has soldiers, Space Force has guardians, a force of just 14,000 now, with many of the senior officers holding STEM-related master's degrees and PhDs.
So we talk about how the warfighter is impacted by the space environment.
The culture, a mix of military and Silicon Valley, more Apple than Air Force, problem-solving high-tech issues orbiting 220 miles above the Earth.
We're small, lean, and agile on purpose, and so we don't have the time to wait for something to go through 5-6 layers of communication chain to get to us.
And side by side in command centers and classrooms, America's closest allies.
We are always stronger together. We will continue to be stronger together. And I think that is always going to be a challenge for any adversary we encounter.
Like it or not, the reality is the battlefield is changing from planet Earth to space. This is the view of the Asian Pacific theater. And the threat matrix in space is very different. It's congested, it's contested, and it's competitive. Just as Russian and U.S. submarines shadow each other in the oceans, a similar game is playing out in space. But how should the U.S. respond with Russia and China testing offensive weapons in space, blowing up their own satellites? In December 2021, astronauts on the space station had to shelter in an escape capsule in case the station was hit by debris from the Russian test. The fear, each exploding satellite could take out another 10 satellites, and each of those another 10, quickly cascading and wiping out the very satellites the world's economies depend on.
These tests, to be sure, are reckless, and they are irresponsible.
In a major policy announcement in April 2022, Vice President Harris called for a global moratorium on anti-satellite tests.
Simply put, these tests are dangerous, and we will not conduct them.
No, that was just silly.
Republican Mike Rogers is the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee.
China and Russia couldn't care less what our stated policy is with regard to things like that. We need to be working on real policy that provides defensive capabilities to protect our satellites from their offensive endeavors.
Space Force commanders say all U.S. satellites, military and commercial, are already targeted by Russia and China, with cyber probes, signal jamming, and laser dazzling. The hope, the more satellites the U.S. puts in orbit, the less effective a single attack would be.
I'm of the opinion that as long as the United States continues on its path of owning the space domain and creating technologies that help us to maintain a commercial edge, I don't think a conflict will happen.
But military and civilian space experts warn China is now outpacing the U.S. in launches and modernizing its own space capabilities, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon, now invisible to U.S. satellites. And China could one day deploy satellites to cislunar, that vast area of space between the moon and Earth. In response, the U.S. is planning to launch its own satellites to monitor both areas. But does the U.S. also have satellite-based weapons? Does the United States have offensive capabilities in space already?
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about what capabilities we may have or not have. I will definitely say that what the Chinese and the Russians have done are irresponsible and frankly do not help in terms of use of the domain.
But many in the military and Congress believe it's time to declassify some of America's offensive capabilities in space.
I also would like for our adversaries to know what we can do. There are some things that we can do that I think would help chill their enthusiasm for aggression if they knew more about our capabilities.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
More than 50 years since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first landed on the moon in 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A 1967 treaty signed by 111 countries, including the U.S., is still in effect, encouraging the peaceful exploration of space and prohibiting military bases on the moon or in space, testing nuclear weapons, and conducting military maneuvers. But the UN treaty does not prohibit non-nuclear weapons. Today, NASA's budget for science and exploration is $24 billion. Space Force, the brand new branch of the military, now has an $18 billion budget, a fraction of the budgets for the Army, Navy, and Air Force.
We can't have open warfare. We've got to discipline ourselves.
Charlie Bolden was a Marine Corps pilot, general, and astronaut before becoming the head of NASA under President Obama.
So that we don't make this potential warfighting domain a real warfighting domain, or a lot of these dreams that we have about exploration and humanity going to places beyond low Earth orbit, they're never going to become true.
Coming up,
Ambush 1112, pick up heading 270 detonator.
The next generation of Air Force officers switching their focus to space.
Threat in the system is showing impact to Los Angeles.
Behind this razor-wired fence in Colorado, a never-before-seen Space Force asset. Under heavy armed guard, this 18-wheeler, packed with top-secret satellite communications gear, is one of several mobile command centers poised to roll out in the event of a cyber or kinetic attack against the U.S. command centers that control GPS and military satellites, presidential communications, and the nuclear chain of command.
Threat in the system is showing impact to Los Angeles.
If your building here takes a hit, if you go offline, you roll these trucks.
That is absolutely true. And the teams that go out are Space Force Guardians that are trained to drive the truck, operate the system, command and control the satellites, and defend. As you can see right here, these are all Space Force members that are weapons qualified, ready to defend those assets if the need were to arise.
112, pick up heading 270 detonator, Chinese Dragon.
Those two are engaging with the target.
Guardian, copy.
Meanwhile, in a dark simulator room at the nearby Air Force Academy,
Following good hits, dead man.
America's next generation of fighter pilots is in the cockpit. But the Academy's future officers have a choice to make. They can stick with a career as airmen or apply to become a guardian with the brand new Space Force, where the focus shifts from flying fighter jets to driving satellites. Satellites come in all sizes, from a school bus to a dishwasher to a cooler to the size of a loaf of bread, providing everything from internet access to university experiments, GPS, and military communications.
We know this is a major threat.
Master Sergeant Bonnie Rushing is one of only 4 NCOs teaching at the Academy.
So in here, what we can do is we can spoof, we can jam, we can take offline or degrade all of our space capabilities.
Satellites.
Satellite, yes, so satellite assets. We can take down their GPS, their communications, their data.
Cadets here are building, flying, and maintaining their own satellites in orbit.
I fell in love with satellite operations, and that kind of wrote the story for the rest of the way as what I wanted to do with my life.
After graduating, senior Courtney Kirkpatrick will head to MIT for a master's degree, then Space Force.
They're creating a new culture. Everything's going to be fast-moving, the digital force, as they call it. That was really attractive to me.
The Air Force Academy graduated its first Space Force officers in 2020. Are they just built for this? Do they seem to have an innate sense of how to operate in this realm?
Oh, absolutely. So what we've seen is we've had to step up our education to keep up with the quality of students that we get.
The big challenge now, holding on to that expertise when the private sector pays so much more. Space Force has another mission, too, to identify and track asteroids and meteors that could pose a threat to Earth, potentially intercepting and destroying those threats in space. The kind of interstellar threat portrayed in the movie Don't Look Up.
There's a comet headed directly towards Earth. Do you know how many the world is ending meetings we've had over the last 2 years?
This comet is what we call a planet killer.
I say we sit tight and assess.
T-minus 5 minutes.
But by its very existence, Space Force creates a public relations dilemma.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
The view of Earth shows no artificial borders, no national territories, only one planet for all of humanity. While the threat posed by Russia and China may be very real, many Americans who grew up idolizing their astronauts and believing deeply in NASA's mission of peaceful exploration find the very talk of a military presence in space to be deeply upsetting.
They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes.
And contrary to the message that Neil Armstrong read, attached to the Apollo 11 lunar lander and still sitting on the moon.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
Sadly, history shows conflict often follows human exploration. In April, Russian cosmonauts on the space station unfolded a replica Soviet-era victory banner during a spacewalk, a not very subtle reminder of the Cold War. The head of the Russian Space Agency, Dmitry Rogozin, a close Putin ally, threatened to start working with the Chinese on their space station and end Russia's cooperation on the International Station. After the U.S. imposed sanctions on high-tech exports to Russia in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion, Rogozin even warned that Moscow could stop providing critical rocket propulsion that keeps the station in orbit, allowing the station to fall back to Earth. To which SpaceX founder Elon Musk replied in a tweet, SpaceX could provide the needed lift. American astronaut Mark Vande Hei was on the station when Rogozin made his threats, but then safely returned to Earth on a Soyuz space capsule.
Touchdown.
Even with all the kind of crazy stories that were coming down about my ability or inability to return to Earth, I just never took those seriously enough. I knew the people I was flying with. I was very confident in the people that I have relationship with in the Russian space program, that I was going to be well taken care of.
The head of NASA says he is not concerned.
Despite a war going on in Ukraine, I see that professional relationship with astronauts and cosmonauts and the ground teams in the two respective mission controls. I see that continuing.
Is military conflict in space inevitable?
I would say absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have the ability, just like we do in other domains with other weapon systems, with other activities, we have the ability not to come to conflict in space.
I think if we ever allow ourselves to get to the point that we feel we need boots on the moon to protect some assets, to protect an American flag or an Apollo landing site, a historic landmark, we're in trouble.
We want the moon to be a peaceful place. We want space to be peaceful. And the concern is now it's becoming a potential battle zone.
We do not want there to be war in space. We do not want there to be conflict. We want all of mankind to enjoy its benefits. But if Russia and China or other actors are going to seek to undermine our capabilities in space, we're going to be ready for that. And so that is why we've created a Space Force in the United States Space Command.
With war raging in Ukraine and Moscow demonstrating its determination to break the post-World War II order, conflict in space doesn't seem as remote as it once did.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.